Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. 50 years from now, when we look back at this pandemic, we will each have a story to tell. I know that I will talk about my new kitchen office with middle schoolers constantly opening and closing the refrigerator just to my right and not being able to hug my mom on Mother's Day. Others will talk about being forced to close their businesses, recount their own illness and recovery, or their struggles with unemployment. While some general narrative of the pandemic will become part of our historical record, our own personal experiences will shed light on the complexity of this pandemic. Our stories will provide the real lived experience behind the statistics and the narrative, and no two experiences will be alike. The Holocaust is an amalgamation of thousands of stories, and just as no two people are alike, no two stories are the same. Behind each is a real person, a real family, trying to navigate a world that is changing beyond anything they have ever known. What will happen when we no longer have the survivors with us to tell their stories firsthand, to answer our questions, to bear witness? This has been the subject of conferences, discussions, and even academic research. Will the history of the Holocaust become corrupted when the survivors are no longer with us to say in person, "I was there, I saw it with my own eyes"? The Holocaust Center for Humanities Speakers Bureau, once comprised only of Holocaust survivors who volunteered their time to share their stories, has defied expectations and is growing in numbers. The children and grandchildren of survivors, some who have grown up with their parents' stories, and others who learned the stories as adults, are sharing the stories anew with a passion and insight and fresh determination to keep these stories real, human, sometimes complicated, but always inspiring in front of us. These legacy speakers, just by their very essence of standing in front of us, are a testament to survival. Our legacy speakers like Michal Lotzkar, who you will hear from today, tell these stories from their hearts, but they have also put in hours and hours working with Lori Werschel-Cohen, who leads our Legacy Speakers Project team, to research their family stories down to the tiniest detail, fact check, unearth photos and connections, and provide context. It's detective work, psychology, persistent curiosity, and a recognition that each person's story is unique and has something new to share with us. The number of legacy speakers on our Speakers Bureau continues to grow. Our Speakers Bureau is more critical now than ever, humanizing the stories and lessons of the Holocaust, keeping them alive and in front of us, and reminding us that there are always real and complicated people that make up our past and pave the way forward. If you are able to help support our Speakers Bureau with a small donation, we would be grateful. You can make a gift on our website, holocaustcenterseattle.org. Just click the donate button in the upper right corner of the homepage. Donations of any size are appreciated. Thank you. I'm so pleased to have with us today Michal Lotzkar to share the story of her father's survival and the legacy of this history on her family. We are also very lucky to have her father and mother tuning in to listen today. If we are lucky, we might see them at the end of the program. Michal is a member of our Speakers Bureau and also one of our expert museum docents. She will answer questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions at any time. Thank you so much, Michal, for being here with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Alana, and thank you everybody for being here today. I would say that some of the silver lining during this unprecedented time that we're living in is that my parents are able to join me today. I'm not sure that my father's actually seen me do my presentation from beginning to end. And in addition to my dad, I have family on this Zoom from all over the world. My brother from Toronto, my brother who is now with my parents in Vancouver, friends in Vancouver, my aunt and uncle from London, England, cousins from Israel, and the cousins that are joining from Israel are my first cousins. So the children of my father's brother, who is also an integral part of this story. So with that being said, thank you again for being here, and I will start sharing my presentation screen. What I'm sharing with you today is the story of my father's survival, my family's survival. I'm going to do this through his memory. My father was a little boy when the Second World War broke out. And I'm also going to be sharing, along with my father's story, some of my own perspectives and musings and feelings about his experiences and how they've impacted me as a second generation to a Holocaust survival. There's a ripple effect. I didn't live through my father's history, but I've certainly been defined by it. And that ripple effect to the second generation Holocaust survivors. So I really see myself as a witness to my father's memory. In this slide, you can see some photos of me. As Alana said, I'm a volunteer docent and I give tours at the museum. And as of late, I'm also a legacy speaker. I speak on behalf of my father. My journey of exploring and contemplating the Holocaust and my family story within it really started for me informally. And many years ago, I always knew since I was a child where my family was from, and some very vague details now and then emerged about what the family endured, but nobody ever talked about the Holocaust. It's just something that nobody talked about. And for nearly 70 years, my father didn't talk about his life during the Nazi reign in 20th century Europe. My father, by nature, is a silent person. He's intuitive, he feels deeply, fiercely committed and loving to us, to his family. And because of that, I think that he didn't want to burden us with horrible stories and painful memories. And he felt that we would just be better off not knowing. But not speaking, of course, spoke very loudly. And the little sips of information I was getting from my father just weren't enough to quench my thirst for wanting more. So my path of wanting to learn about my family is one that I initially, as I said earlier, it was informal and I followed it intuitively through books and movies about the Holocaust, a little bit of what my father offered, and then the Holocaust Center came into my life. When my daughter was in grade school, I was a parent chaperone on a school trip to the Holocaust Center. And as the docent was presenting to the children artifacts and documents, it stirred something in me. And after the tour, I went to the docent and I said to her, you know, my father has a bunch of those. And she peppered me with a few questions and then said to me, your father's a Holocaust survivor. Would he be willing to give us his testimony? And that kind of took my breath away a little bit because for the first time ever, I heard my father being called a Holocaust survivor. My father never referred to himself as a Holocaust survivor. And I said to her, my father wasn't in a concentration camp. And she explained to me that there's a spectrum of what survivors are, what Holocaust survivors are. There were camp survivors, there were ghetto survivors, there were survivors that were hidden, survivors in hiding, and my family has a very unique story of survival of their own. And going home with that, I nudged my father more on it, and I think that opportunity and timeliness came to a crossroads, and my father was willing to give his testimony. And for the first time in my life, I heard my father give his full account of what happened to the family. So here in the next slide is kind of the next steps that happened. My father gave his oral testimony And I started with my father transcribing his written narrative. And with the Holocaust Center, we collected whatever pictures my father has, and there certainly weren't very many. You can see on the left here, these are my grandmother's parents. And on the right here, this is my grandfather. He's in a uniform of the Austro-Hungarian army in which he served in World War I. And this is his sister with 2 out of her 8 children. All of her and all of her children, with the exception of who was then this little boy, all perished in Auschwitz. We also collected what I now know in the museum world is called primary source documents. And those were all of my father's school certificates, which were really the only way that we had to trace what happened to the family and where they were taken to. A lot of web-based resources were used to trace where the communists had taken my family over a period of more than a decade, or nearly a decade. Many of these places no longer exist, so those web-based resources to find them were very helpful. And certainly the PowerPoint and the research and development of all of this came at the hands of the Holocaust Center, who I'm so grateful for. And all of this was done alongside my father, which I'm so lucky to have with me, because Holocaust survivors are fading away. This has been, it continues to be, for me, a journey of knowing and understanding my father. And I also feel that every time I share my presentation, I get to spend some time with my grandparents. I'm bringing them to life through their story. The memories and the stories my father has finally shared with me have kind of created, I would say, a ... of my family history and chronology, like what comes next. I have the torch now, and I feel the responsibility to tell the story to the next generation, to keep those memories alive through what I've learned and what I've heard. And I have to be very honest with you today that I struggle with that responsibility. Am I getting it right? And how do I make what happened in the past relevant to my children, to everybody that's listening to my presentation? The Holocaust Center has helped me find my voice. Where do I fit in? This process of memorializing, continue to honor my family's legacy, as well as paying the lessons in history, from history forward, is a process I always wanted to be engaged in. I knew why I wanted to do this, but I didn't have the how, and now I do. So let me introduce you to my dad.
Good morning. My name is Ari Engelberg. I was born in Tarnobrzeg, near Krakow, in Poland, in 1934.
In this next slide, my father talks more about the Jews of Tarnobrzeg and the community in which he came from. Oh, not just yet. First, a little bit of history of my family in Poland. My family comes from many generations of being good Polish citizens. My family had a leasehold on lands before World War I. They were a family that farmed initially, and then they developed bars and hotels and other businesses. On my grandmother's side, they were fabric merchants. My grandparents ran an inn in Tarnobrzeg. So they had a nice life. And here in this picture below, you see my grandmother. They look quite fancy here, and she has a walking stick. And I believe here that she was with a group of friends in Carlsbad at a beer festival.
My father was of a farming family in Poland. They had a leasehold from the Count of Tarnowski and farmed for a long period of time before the war, before even the First World War. And they had different businesses around it, including bars and hotels and stuff like that.
And here's a little bit more about what my father described to me in the community of Tarnobjeg.
It was a community that was bound together by family ties or groups and so on, and those were the makers, the doers, or whatever. And there was a religious group too. The Poles, because there is no single Jew there until now in Tarnobrzeg, the locals wrote about it, and they created this, what they call historical files, and described in the first file of this periodical, they described the Jews of Tarnobrzeg. And obviously names like Engelberg are there.
This is an interesting piece here that my father talks about, and I actually have these historical files of the Jewish community of Tarnobrzeg. If anybody is interested, I have it. The Holocaust Center has a copy. And a few of the things that, because this was the non-Jews that were writing about this Jewish community, is that they wrote that the Jews were all literate, they didn't drink much, and they all bathed at least once a week on Friday for Shabbat, of course. So as my family was going about their business, running their inn, raising their boys, doing kind of normal everyday life things, anti-Semitism, that prejudice and hatred against Jews that always existed in Europe and in Russia for hundreds of years, was reaching new levels in Western Europe. My father actually has told me the story that he remembers that an inspector would come now and again to the inn that my grandparents owned, and he actually warned my grandparents of what was happening in Western Europe. And this is something that we often talk about, and I talk about on my tours at the Holocaust Center, that people didn't know what to do. Prejudice against Jews, anti-Semitism existed in Europe for hundreds of years. And so, you know, Jews have always weathered the storm. They would weather this one too. Nobody knew what was to come. My father also remembers, and remember that he was a little boy, so as a 4 or 5-year-old, as a child, you sort of get things by osmosis. You absorb the feelings of the adults around you. But he remembers this speech right here, Hitler's fiery speech. He remembers a bunch of adults kind of gathering around the single radio, and remember sort of anxious looks on people's faces. 1939, this is an important year. This marks the beginning of World War II. The Germans and the Soviets divided Poland up. The eastern part became annexed by the Soviet Union, the western part by Germany under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement. And my father has some memories of this time, of their home being bombed and burned. You can see here a little bit better where the division was under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement. And so my family being here on the German side, they were expelled. They were kicked out. They were kicked out by the Polish authorities under the direction of the Nazis. And they were expelled because they were Jewish. My family wasn't particularly wealthy. They weren't influential. They weren't political. They were expelled because they were Jewish. And at the time, the Nazis were not quite yet organized with ghettos and camps. And so in a way, my father talks about this as was kind of their saving grace that they were expelled. You can see here that Auschwitz was not too far from Tarnobrzeg, about a 2-hour drive. And I actually think this yellow arrow here is covering Lublin, which is where my mother's side of the family came from. And my mother's grandparents and extended family, they were all murdered in Belzec, not too far away either. And so my grandfather decided that the safest place for the family was to go east.
After a while, a word came that the Russians or the Soviets are going to take all those who did not belong to this place, who were not local, and they were in their eyes an unreliable element because they didn't belong there, so that they will take them all and deport to Siberia. So obviously, my parents didn't want that, and many Jews didn't want to be deported. They wanted to be close to home. The war will be over soon, and they will go back home. But obviously, it didn't happen, and we hid in a farmer's house. I, with my mother, were in the farmer's house itself. My father, with my two brothers, were hidden in the barn of the same farm. And as it happened in the morning, and it was already spring, it wasn't that cold, and I saw vividly through the window of the place where we slept a Russian soldier led by our landlord, our previous landlord, and he led them to the farmer's house. And the Russian soldier, he was not vicious, and he was completely calm. He didn't smile or anything like it, but he was not vicious. And we were led out of the house. My father, seeing that from the barn, he came out. He came out and joined us. And I remember the short conversation that the parents had in Yiddish. Why did you come out? So he kind of responded, what do you mean? You are led out. And so we all were taken on a truck, and with this truck taken to the railway station and loaded onto cattle cars.
This part of the testimony has so many elements to it. I should also mention that the move from Tarnobrzeg to Moshitsko, the closest Soviet town, so that the family could be as close to home as possible, because as my father said, the war's going to be over soon, and we're all just going to be able to go home. Everybody just wanted to go home, to go back to their normal lives. That this was a walk. This was a walk, I'm not sure how long it was. But my father was a little boy, and at 5 years old, he just wanted uppy. And this was too long of a walk for him. And he has some memories as a child of my two older uncles walking with my grandmother, and my grandfather holding him in his arms as they walked to Moshitsko, the closest Soviet town where they thought they could ride out the war, but that was not to be. One of the things that we talk about at the Holocaust Center, the set of ideas that we teach about, is the idea of upstander, bystander, victim, and perpetrator. And what my father talks about here really encapsulates all of that. Here they were afraid. They were afraid to be moved deep into Siberia by the communists. A farmer stepped up, here, I'll help you, I'll hide you. And then somebody gave them up, a previous landlord gave them up. Why would this person give them up? Maybe he was an anti-Semite, maybe he didn't want to be associated with Jews. Why did this upstander, this farmer, why was he willing to take them in? And then there was this Russian soldier. As my father said, he wasn't vicious, he was just doing his job. Like many other soldiers, Nazis, everybody was just doing a job. Was he the perpetrator, a supporter? And then, of course, my family, the victims, that they were helpless in this situation. And so the formative years of my father's life were really shaped by this. That's what he remembers, a lot of cattle cars. And one of the things that he talked to me about was at the beginning, because there were many cattle cars in his life, that he needed help getting up into the cattle car, that his father would pick him up and put him in the cattle car. And he said, by the end of the war, I didn't need that anymore. I could get up into that cattle car on my own. And so from Moshitsko, the family was taken to a settlement where there was kind of a labor camp settlement called Ninasny. From there, the family was moved by the communists to another camp called Svietly, where my father started school. And from there to Bodaibo. And everywhere the family was moved to, my grandparents made sure that the boys were enrolled in school wherever they could. And the idea of education, providing the education under all costs, was extremely important to them. And this is still a value that carries on in my family, that whatever you invest in your mind, whatever skill set you've invested in, is something that can never be taken away from you. Your home can be taken away from you, your citizenship can be taken away from you, but what you've invested in your mind, that will always stay with you. Here we have a few of my father's school certificates. And as I've mentioned earlier, this was really the only way that we could trace all the different places that the family went to. And I wanted to point out the school certificate on the left in particular. One of the things that my father remembers so vividly, along with the deplorable living conditions, all the different places that my grandfather labored in mining, in forestry, everything toward the war effort, is that there were shortages. There were shortages all the time, particularly of food. And here there was a shortage of paper. And this school teacher actually used recycled paper, the back of a notebook, to write my father's report card. And he was always very proud of that. After a while, in 1944, my family was moved back across Russia, back into the Western region. The reason being is that the Soviets needed people to farm the very the breadbasket of Europe, which was in the Volga River basin. And my father talks about that in this next part of his testimony.
They did not leave Siberia. They were taken by the authorities elsewhere. What happened during the war, the Russians had a big settlement of Germans that settled there during the Tsarist times of Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and so on. And they had settlements along the Volga River, which was too close for comfort for the Soviet regime. So they actually took all the Germans when the German armies were progressing into Russia. They took all the Germans and sent them to Siberia. But the region across along the river Volga was the breadbasket of all of Russia, if not half of Europe during the Tsarist times. So they needed people to settle this place. So they took all those that were in Siberia and took them and us. And then we met many other Jews that came from other settlements and other regions from Siberia or other places, and met them and created a new community.
What my father describes here as a very communist tactic, when there were these unreliable elements, like my father's family, and certainly my family weren't the only ones. It was to the tune of hundreds and thousands of Jews that were expelled from many shtetl towns all over Poland. The tactic was to move people into Siberia. And now it was, there was sort of a switching that my family was moved back, and thousands of others to work the Volga River basin, while the people that were untrustworthy, or so the communists thought, were moved to Siberia. Interesting. I talked to you about the shortages, many shortages. My grandparents were raising 3 boys with insatiable appetites, and there were always food shortages. My father speaks to that in this next part of his testimony.
But wheat had to be stolen, because you were not allowed to own wheat. You were allowed to have flour. So it was a commonplace to fill up the pans. People had pans tied up on the bottom and fill up the pans with some wheat in it. And at one point, a word came that an inspector is coming to town, and they are going to search all these huts for illegal activity. He hid away the bag of wheat we had, but he didn't hide it well enough. It was found, and my father was taken to court and sentenced for 2 years in jail.
When I look at my father's formative years, since the age of 4 or 5 years old through his teenage years, his childhood was stolen from him. The family's living conditions under the communist regime, constantly being moved around, not knowing where they were going and for how long, constantly feeling anxious, fearful of the communists, cold, hungry. So little information was getting into Siberia, and it was always filtered. Sharing living spaces with other families where there was no privacy, there was no opportunity to share, to be open about things, to show emotion. And then your father gets taken off to a communist prison for stealing wheat. I very often try to extract from my father, well, what did you feel when he was taken? Every time you moved, did my grandmother cry? Did you talk about it? No, nobody talked about it. They were very stoic. They just needed to be in survival mode all the time. For many years, they were in survival mode. And what about enjoyment? Little boy years, these are years where he should be playing with a train set, having bedtime stories and going out for walks in the park. My father never had any of that. So enjoyment, that word never even entered the vernacular of his testimony. So he never really had an idea of child development. And why would he? So as an adult, I think that's why he didn't know if he should tell us stories, who he should tell the stories to, when, what details to share, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, at what age. So he just didn't talk about it at all. I would say that my father now enjoys his life, perhaps not fully, because you have to watch out. You never show that you're vulnerable, because vulnerable people die. And so here I'm telling you my father's story because I want to preserve and pass on this legacy. But this is one area that I struggle with. I've decided to not pass on this part of the legacy and even try to repair it, repair that inability to share and to be vulnerable, to talk about difficult, unpleasant things. I want my children, I want everybody who's listening to this to have license to be vulnerable. And I think that when my father started talking, he actually felt that by sharing the heavy weight of this traumatic burden he was carrying, felt quite liberating and empowering to him. So we carry on with the story. After the war ended, the communists allowed my family to go back to Poland. My grandfather had not been released from prison yet, but once he was, he rejoined the family and they resettled in a town called Kłodzko. Here are my father's school certificates from Kłodzko, and you can see that they're both in Yiddish and in Polish. He went to a Jewish school that was set up by some relief agencies in Kłodzko. My grandparents recognized that it wasn't safe for Jews to stay in Poland even after the war. It's not like there was instant contrition that Jews felt safe. There was still pogroms, very infamous big pogrom in Kielce. So my grandparents were still fearful and they wanted to leave. So they applied for visas to Israel in 1948 and finally received them in 1950, where they needed to, the family had to give up their Polish citizenships and they moved on to Israel. So by train and by boat, they moved to Israel, and certainly throughout all of this, education for my dad, for my uncles, his brothers, continued, and my grandparents chose in Israel to settle in a small town called Nesher because it was close to the Technion, where my father and my uncles learned to become engineers. So arrival in Israel was in 1950. Initially, the family was resettled in a camp before they moved to Nesher, and they certainly weren't the only ones. This was the resettlement of thousands of Holocaust survivors. And you have to remember that they arrived in Israel, which was a very young country under the constant threat of war with many social and economic problems. There was struggle enough with so many things and struggle to absorb so many immigrants, let alone listen to Holocaust experiences and tend to the post-traumatic needs of the Holocaust survivors. And so it's almost as though my family went from one traumatic situation to another traumatic situation, very different situations, but the struggles and the hardships certainly kept going. Life wants to be lived, and my father attended the Technion. He graduated as a mechanical engineer. He met my mom. You can see them in this beautiful picture here. My father also served in the IDF, and here's my father here. And here is a picture of my dad and my grandmother at my parents' wedding. And I love this picture. And I look at my grandmother here, and I love this picture so much because it's the only picture I have of her smiling. And my father often describes my grandparents as having fallen from grace after the Holocaust. And I ask my dad, well, what was she like? What did she like? Did she ever wear lipstick? Did they ever go to the movies? No, never. Their entire existence was about the boys. Everything was about my dad and his brothers. Here are a few pictures of my family in Israel. We were there until 1976. My dad and his brothers all got married. The boys had children. And here's a picture of my brothers and I when we were little. Here's a picture of me, first day of first grade. Here's a picture of my family and my aunt, who now lives in London, England, and she's on this Zoom call today. My father then had an opportunity to be an engineer in Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. So that's where my family moved in 1976. And here we are in Vancouver. We grew up, life went on. A photo of my mother, she was a school teacher at the Jewish Day School in Vancouver for many years. I got married eventually. Here's a picture of me at my bat mitzvah, university graduation. So there's kind of this interesting question about Holocaust survivors, and do the children of Holocaust survivors inherit the trauma of their parents? Is it possible that history can imprint itself on our genetic code? There's been studies done about this. Studies that have found that Holocaust survivors had changes to a gene associated with stress, as did their children who were born after the Holocaust. And certainly this is still emerging research, you know, too soon to tell with definity whether trauma is inherited. But I think that for me, what I inherited is perhaps less tangible, more nuanced. I understood from a very young age that something happened, something traumatic, something sinister that nobody wanted to talk about, but I still got it by osmosis through an environment that was created in the household. And my parents, as Holocaust survivors, also sacrificed on behalf of my brothers and I. They always worked very hard as Canadian immigrants, immigrants to Canada. They were intensely focused on our success. There was always an expectation to become highly educated professionals. And my parents always fully participated in any activities having to do with Israel, with the Holocaust. I remember very well, still today, that on Holocaust Memorial Day, that my parents fully participate in everything the Jewish community of Vancouver offers, the lighting of the Yortzeit candles, the ceremonies, and then they live stream those ceremonies from Israel, Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron, Remembrance Day, Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. So it was always palpable that this isn't something they're just watching out of great interest. This belongs to them. This is part of their past. So my family was moved. They were expelled. They were moved deep into Siberia, and over the course of 10 years, their journey was long. From the time the Germans invaded Poland to the time my family settled in Israel, they had traveled 12,350 miles. That's like going all the way from the North Pole to the South Pole, and an additional 6,000 miles to reach Vancouver. In 1994, I married my soulmate, my husband, Gordon Lotzkar, and he wanted to move to the United States. We eventually became US citizens and started our family here. A few years ago, we had a intergenerational trip back to Israel. And in this picture, you see here my grandparents and my dad, his middle brother, which is my one uncle that's still alive, and his daughters, my first cousins, are on this call today. My other uncle who passed away, and here we are at the cemetery visiting him and my grandparents. When I look at this picture, I see heroes. My grandparents my grandparents were the heroes. And it turns out that not all heroes, not all heroes wear capes. Their superpower was that they were extraordinarily resilient and strong. They had fortitude and they had a purpose. Their purpose was their 3 beautiful boys right here. And so for me, I hope that I've inherited, yes, I inherited trauma, but I hope that I also inherited their superpowers. So yes, this is part of my identity. It's my inheritance. It's a sensibility in which I look out onto the world. And I feel the need to remember and to keep the family history alive is more urgent now than ever. There's a lot more anti-Semitism everywhere. There is more hatred, and people seem to be more comfortable with making hateful expressions because of social media. And so there's this question, how much have we learned? Have we learned from history? For me, I've come to learn and understand more clearly through my dad's memory, this history. And I hope that by presenting it to you today with this presentation, that it's also become more meaningful and relevant and impactful for you. I want people to understand that hatred and intolerance, prejudice, these aren't things that we're born with. These are learned behaviors. Nobody is born hateful. And in much the same way, we can also learn open-mindedness, reasoning, to embrace differences, that the world was wrong. The whole world was wrong to stand by and do nothing. What did the Nazis achieve with their obsessive hatred? Hatred that, unfortunately, we still see today. Hatred of Jews, of Blacks, of LGBTQ, anyone who is the other. The lesson from the Holocaust is not to dehumanize anyone. When we say never again, that should mean for everyone. So I'm going to share with you a few parting words of wisdom from my dad.
Look how lucky you are. Enjoy what you are having. Bless every moment of your good life. And if there are some difficulties, don't worry, there are harsher things that you can survive. Did we learn anything? Well, we are trying.
Thank you so much, Michal, for this very important and moving story. We have a number of questions from some of our participants. I'll read off a couple. One of them is asking about your grandparents and if where they ended up living and if they stayed in Israel.
They ended up living in Nesher. It's a suburb of Haifa, close to the Technion. They chose that spot so that my dad and my uncles could be close to the place where they went to school, and they lived out the rest of their years there. They are buried in the cemetery in Nesher. That photo that you saw was of the cemetery in Nesher in Israel. Yes.
Great. Another question that we received is, have you been to Poland? And did you visit some of the places where your father was? And do you speak Polish?
Well, the easiest one to answer is no, I don't speak Polish. And I wish I spoke Yiddish. You know, that was spoken in the home and always spoken between my grandparents and both my parents grew up with Yiddish. And I think that's a language that's eventually going to fade away. As for having been to Poland, yes. In 2016, my mother and I had a very impactful trip. We wanted my father to join us. he didn't want to. My mother and I went on the March of the Living, and we visited ghettos and camps and mass graves. And because we were kind of in this group together, we didn't specifically go to Tarnobrzeg. We were in Lublin, which is where my mother's side of the family was. It was a much larger city, but we didn't specifically go to Tarnobrzeg. That's a place I have yet to visit.
Thank you. And I hope those of you who are listening today, I hope you can see that we're very lucky that we have Michal's parents with us here today. So hopefully you can see them on your screen. And if you have questions for them as well, you're welcome to type those into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Another question that we received, Michal, was, have your children taken an interest in Holocaust education and in this story?
Yes, very much so. And that's an interesting question, and one that I contemplate and I ponder, what am I passing on to my children? That's sort of the shock wave for my father was obviously the most intense. He lived it. It was passed on to me, but the shock waves have dulled. And they dull even more to the next generation, that they see the Holocaust and define it differently. And you know, every once in a while, you know, my kids see me and they'll say to me something like, "Don't you ever read any other books except Holocaust books? Is that all you ever read?" And so they certainly know and understand the impact and how important it is. It certainly comes out every once in a while in a school project, in a painting, in something, a subject that they've chosen to write about, and without impetus for me, that I see that they do that. My daughter last year went on the Alexander Muss High School program in Israel, and part of that program, they take the kids to Poland. And this was incredibly impactful for her. And before she went to Poland, she called me and texted me constantly. And I think because of my family history, she was very fearful of the emotional impact that it would have on her. So I would say, yes, absolutely. My children, like me, are getting it genetically. They're getting it by osmosis.
Mm-hmm. Another question we received, I'm going to read it to you. It says, I teach English and Spanish in a small high school. For the past few years, I have taken my students to the Holocaust Center so they may learn about the Holocaust, so the stories may be told. I want my students to learn about what happened and to carry those lessons into their futures. If you had one message to pass on to my students, what would that message be? And that could be a question for any of you.
Yeah, I would say that's a loaded question. Very evolved question. And I would say that I finished my presentation with this thought, and how can you kind of summarize it in 25 words or less? And I would say, don't dehumanize anyone. Don't dehumanize anyone.
Thank you. Okay, and we have maybe one last question here. It says, can you talk about the experience of interviewing your father? How did he feel about opening up and speaking about his past?
Well, I'd love for my father to weigh in a little bit as well. It's an extraordinary journey. It's one that we are still on together. I think it's brought us closer. I'm so grateful that I have my father to fact check with, for him to still share memories. Stories keep emerging even after he gave his testimony. So it's been this collaborative work that I'm very grateful that I have. And I think that many children of Holocaust survivors won't have that. And it sort of came into their life after their parents passed away. So I'm very lucky that this has come into my life early enough on for not only for me to have this with my dad, but for my children to be on it as well. A couple of years ago, I think maybe it was 2 or 3 years ago, my father and I were interviewed on a radio talk show on KNKX, and I think at one time it was posted on the Holocaust Center website, and I know that it's on the KNKX website, and the theme of the show was passing the torch, because that is what my father is doing. He's passing the torch to me. And he was interviewed in Vancouver. I was interviewed here in Kirkland, Washington, where I live. And even after having many discussions with him about the Holocaust and kind of transcribing his oral testimony and his written testimony, that things came out of the interview that I didn't know that he was going to say, and he didn't know that I was going to say. So we're continuously learning about each other, and that's pretty cool.
That was a really wonderful, wonderful interview that was done. Yeah, really wonderful.
Abba, did you want to share any of how that's been for you, this collaborative journey that you and I have been on?
Yes, first of all, I would like to say that I am thankful to you. And actually, I was always thinking whether you or whoever listens to me, whether they got the message that I wanted to pass on. And I'm really happy that you did a great job, and it's heartwarming to hear it, that others got the message that I wanted to pass through you. And I am thankful to you and the Holocaust Center of Humanity that created a situation where it was possible. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that. We are so lucky to have you all with us. And Arieh and Sarah, thank you for joining us today. I feel like that has really just added to this really incredible program in the hall for all your research and time and dedication to the Holocaust Center for Humanity, both as a speaker and a docent. We just sincerely thank you all for sharing these messages and for making these stories come to life. I want to take just a moment also to thank our incredible team at the Holocaust Center for Humanity that continues to work from home and put together programs like this one, along with arranging virtual presentations from our Speakers Bureau like Michal, online teacher seminars, book talks, and more. So I'm going to list them off because I think each one of them deserves incredible recognition, including, of course, our Executive Director, Dee Simon, Nicole Bella, our Director of Development, Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, Lori Werschel-Cohen and her team working on our Speakers Bureau Legacy Project, our education team, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrugge, Rosa Campos, Amanda Davis, our Senior Operations and Engagement Officer, and our development team, Sydney Draytel and Ellie Selesky, and of course, Katie Lawrence, our Administration Coordinator. We are grateful for all of your support and for attending this program today. I hope you will join us again next Tuesday at noon for a very special program with world-renowned author and scholar, Dr. James Waller, who will discuss why populations at risk of genocide are more vulnerable now than ever as countries and economies are weakened by COVID-19. Find out more and what we can do to help next week. Thank you again for joining us today. And this concludes our program.